I'm good to get started here.
Go right ahead.
Great. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We've got something that we think is pretty timely and newsworthy on the economic impacts of the rise of fentanyl in Arizona. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Daniel Scarpinato. I'm strategic advisor for the Common Sense Institute of Arizona. The Common Sense Institute is a nonpartisan research organization that's focused on jobs and the economy here in Arizona. Our sister organization began in Colorado over a decade ago, and we launched CSI Arizona in March. As you know, there's a lot of heated political rhetoric out there these days, and CSI Arizona's mission is really to stick to the facts and to examine the fiscal impacts of policies, initiatives, and proposed laws so that Arizonans and policymakers are more educated and informed on the issues out there. Here's really what makes us different from other think tanks and organizations in the state. We do no advocacy. We're not a C4. We don't get involved in campaigns. We don't say vote for or against anything. We're all about data and information, and that's really what makes us unique, and we're completely nonpartisan. Joining us today on the call are a few folks that I just want to briefly introduce. Kristen Strom, who's CEO of CSI, Glenn Farley, who produced today's report. He's Director of Policy and Research for CSI. Job Dickinson, who's Executive Director of the Combined Law Enforcement Association of Arizona. Job, thanks for joining us. Our County Attorney here in Maricopa County, Rachel Mitchell, thank you for joining us. We will be recording this press conference, so please leave your email in the chat if you would like us to share that with you afterwards. And we will have some time for questions. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat when you have them, and we'll answer them at the end. And then if you're interested in actually coming on and asking your question on here, we're going to try to make that function work as well. So first of all, I just want to hand it over to Job, and if you have any brief remarks on behalf of CLIA, Job, about this overall issue of fentanyl before we walk through the report.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Job Dickinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Combined Law Enforcement Associations of Arizona. We have about 2,100 members, mainly in Southern Arizona. A little bit about my history. I lived in Tucson my entire life, became a police officer, worked about 20 years in law enforcement, anywhere from frontline officer, auto theft detective, up to supervisor, frontline supervisor. So kind of have a lot of boots on the ground experience of the drug trade, different things that happen, auto theft, especially moving us, vehicles down to Mexico, transportation back and forth across the border. One other job that I'm doing, I'm also the president of the Border Security Alliance, which is a newly formed foundation that we're trying to have public-private partnership to get some better border policies that help support our law enforcement officers. So I'm happy to be here today.
Great. Thank you so much. Rachel Mitchell, thank you for joining us. Any remarks before we get started?
Yes, thank you for having me on this. And obviously, this is a great concern to my office because of the epidemic proportions we're seeing. And so I'm pleased to be a part of this.
Great. Thank you. Well, we've all heard a lot in the news about the impact of fentanyl in Arizona and nationally. And today we have some new data that we think sheds a lot of light on the crisis and on the real hard economic impacts on our state and on law enforcement. So I'm going to hand it over to Glenn Farley to walk us through the report.
Thank you, Daniel. And again, my name is Glenn Farley, Director of Policy and Research for the Common Sense Institute here in Arizona. Previously, like Daniel said, Governor Ducey's chief economist. And this report was very interesting to produce just because this is a subject that has been talked about extensively in isolation. But I think in the course of our research and communicating with law enforcement groups, federal, state, and local law enforcement groups, reading various reports, looking at the work that other groups had already done, and then just looking at the history of the problem, it became very clear that the crisis was sort of multi-pronged, and all of these independent events sort of came to a head simultaneously in the past couple of years to enable it to be as big a problem and to grow as quickly as it in fact did. And just to put a little color and context on the scale of the problem that we're talking about, in 2017, the CDC produced an estimate of the nationwide cost of opioid addiction, and it found that the Arizona specific costs at the time were about $21 billion. Using that report and that methodology, I was able to produce a time series of the costs of opioid addiction in Arizona over time from about 2010 to today. And the cost last year reached a peak record of about $53 billion. And that's combined costs of loss of life from fatal opioid overdose, which are the largest single component of the total costs, reduced productivity and quality of life for folks suffering from opioid addiction, law enforcement and medical treatment costs, as well as a cost that's novel and unique. It's a relatively small component of the total $53 billion cost, but unique to border states like Arizona, and that's the cost of border security. So Arizona today, and it hasn't in the past, but today and since about 2017 has had a specific line item dollar amount in the state budget specifically to try and improve security at its southern border. And that's a cost shouldered entirely by the state, traditionally a cost that was shouldered by the federal government. And those costs have roughly tripled over the past decade, from about $15 billion in 2010 to over $50 billion this year. So the question then becomes, how did we get here? How did the problem grow so large? And like I alluded to, there were really, it appears, three separate events or three separate policy decisions, conscious policy decisions made. Each of those decisions were made independently and for independent reasons, but they all contributed unintentionally to the current opioid crisis. And the first and largest factor is the crisis at the southern border. So specifically, as we all know, we've all seen talked about, migrant encounters by Border Patrol at the southern border are dramatically up, and that's the blue curve in the chart on the right on your screen. The historical long-run averages are significantly below current levels, about 500,000, peaking at 1 million in 2019, which was the last record year. Today, we're on track to exceed 3 million encounters in 2022, which is just a number without precedent, right? The consequence appears to be that federal law enforcement authorities have had to shift their efforts away from law enforcement and drug interdiction and into migrant processing. And so, as you can see, the blue curve is sort of drug seizures, and drug seizures indeed by CBP were trickling up between 2017 and 2020, which we would expect given the rise in demand for fentanyl. But that activity sort of collapses after 2020 at the same time that migrant encounters start to spike. So I think we clearly see a substitution away from drug seizures and towards processing and interdiction of migrants. The other event, which I show on the chart on the left, is the crackdown on access to prescription painkillers that really came to a head in the United States on and around 2015 and 2016. It was a rising crisis that began in the early 2000s. At peak, there were something like 240 million active prescription painkiller prescriptions in the United States. And the perception really shifted over a couple of decades from prescription painkillers being safe and non-addictive to potentially dangerous and definitely addictive. And so a crackdown was imposed. Active prescriptions have fallen by about half from the peaks, but it appears that this has indirectly contributed to the rise in demand for illegal substitutes like fentanyl-laced street drugs and counterfeit prescriptions available on the street. As a consequence, you can see in the green and red curves, while fatal overdoses attributable to prescription opioids are down, it's hardly noticeable on the scales of this chart. On the other hand, fatal overdoses due to abuse of fentanyl, which is far more dangerous than some of these alternative opioids, particularly prescriptions, are way up. So that substitution effect appears to have had the unintended consequence of potentially increasing fatalities and increasing opioid-related healthcare costs. So I did assert that CBP is seizing less drugs because it's focusing more on migrant processing and less on drug interception. But how do we know that's true? Is it not possible that it's simply the case that fewer drugs are getting across the southern border? That's a hard problem to address directly, right? It's hard to prove those kinds of counterfactuals looking at data, particularly when we're talking about black market activities, right? There's no good records about how many drugs are being flowed across the southern border. We only know what we're seizing, but we can sort of proxy it. And so what this chart shows you is Cbp seizures of fentanyl specifically. So previous chart was all drugs excluding marijuana by Cbp. This is just fentanyl in just Arizona by Cbp. And that's the red curve. The blue bars are seizures by Arizona DPS of fentanyl just in the state's border counties. And I was able to get that data going back to about 2019, and the relationship is clear. DPS is encountering exponentially more fentanyl in the state's border counties today than it was 2 years ago. At the same time, CBP is seizing far, far less fentanyl at the Arizona border than it was a couple of years ago. So I think this confirms what we've heard anecdotally from a lot of our friends in the law enforcement community, which is that in fact, more drugs than ever are probably coming across, and it is not the case that the federal law enforcement is doing as good a job as it once was in stopping the seizure of those drugs. And this is, of course, highly coincident with that massive increase in the number of migrant encounters that CBP has had to deal with since 2020. So what are the consequences? Well, I already talked about this at the beginning of the presentation, but the largest consequence in the chart on the right is just the dramatic increase in fatal opioid overdoses, but also in non-fatal opioid dependence, which imposes its own costs, law enforcement costs, healthcare costs, and just productivity costs. The quality of life for individuals dependent on these opioids is much reduced. Their productivity is much reduced. They tend to work less, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are those costs, but there are also other practical coincident costs, right? Law enforcement resources, at least on a per capita basis, have been trickling down over time, independent of this phenomena. The blue line in the chart on the left shows for Phoenix Police Department the number of law enforcement officers per 1,000 people since 2010. At the same time, violent crime rates in the urban cities of the United States since about 2020, even a little bit before then, have been dramatically increasing. And sure enough, you can see that after being sort of flat between 2010 and 2016, from and after 2017, crime rates in Phoenix, the largest urban city in Arizona, rose and then spiked again in 2020, the most recent year for which we have complete data. So there are more violent crimes, fewer police officers per capita. Now, compounding this problem is since 2020, Phoenix PD and other state and local law enforcement officials have had to spend more and more time and resources policing the opioid trafficking and the drug crisis, which again takes resources away from, just as CBP has to reallocate resources, so too state and local law enforcement have to reallocate resources away from violent crime and general state and local street crime towards this kind of drug interdiction activity. And finally, again, to put in chart form what I alluded to at the beginning of this, which is just the dramatic rise in costs. So as many on this call probably recall, in I believe it was 2016, the governor declared there was a crisis in Arizona that was coincident with many other states making similar declarations. Unfortunately, if there was a crisis, then clearly the crisis is much worse here. And this is not a trend that's unique to Arizona. In fact, Arizona is doing better than some other states. There are states, California, Oregon, Colorado, that have taken a different approach from a law enforcement perspective to kind of the treatment and regard of drug abuse. And that has resulted in even higher rates of use there. But a unique cost to Arizona is as of this year, the most recently passed budget, the state is allocating something like $300 million from its general fund specifically to border security efforts. And that's a cost that non-border states don't have to bear. It's a cost that traditionally has been borne by federal law enforcement. And frankly, we can't keep up. While that from a state budgeting perspective is massive, the resources available to Customs and Border Protection are exponentially greater than the resources available to DPS, even with the infusion of cash in the most recent budget. And reiterating again the key findings that I summarized for you at the beginning: economic costs have roughly tripled over 10 years. Law enforcement encounters by state and local officials are surging, even as encounters by CBP and federal officials have sort of collapsed since 2020. And that collapse in federal encounters with fentanyl and other hard drugs occurred coincident with the massive increase in migrant flows. Specifically in 2020, migrant flows were about 15% their current rate. And it really is kind of striking when you chart it over time. When people throw these numbers out on the nightly news, 2-3 million, it's hard really to quantify. But when you see it charted visually, I still remember when the 2019 surge occurred, how that was characterized in the media as an unprecedented crisis. And now it barely shows up as a blip in the long-term trend relative to what's happened in the past 18 months or so.
Great. Well, thank you, Glenn. Appreciate the presentation. Job, any thoughts, any observations here to add?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I really appreciate Glenn giving the presentation and getting that data that shows anecdotally what I see on the streets, what we see on the streets every day. Representing police officers in local localities, sheriff's deputies, we are now taking the responsibility when we're seizing these loads of drugs that are no longer being stopped at the border because Border Patrol is tied up, dealing with the migrant issue, dealing with ports or the certain spots that they're coming across. And the drug dealers are taking advantage of that. The cartels are taking advantage of that. And I think it's purposefully done. The other issues when we talk calls for service, local police, we're there to respond to our car accidents and our domestic violence and our burglaries. But now every officer this day and age, we're issued Narcan. We respond to those unknown troubles. We respond to medical issues from these overdoses. It's really a big deal for us, taking a lot of time and resources. And just like Phoenix PD, Tucson PD, statistically, we're understaffed from where we were years ago. The numbers just keep going down. Lastly, I'd like to just hit on, when the prescriptions were there were overdoses, but the pills were controlled. Those were manufactured, coming through pharmacies. Now, and that kept the price. The pretty expensive pill maybe is $20 a pill, street level. Now with these coming across the border illegally, these chemicals being shipped in and produced down in Mexico, these fentanyl, you don't know what you're getting. So you might be getting a pill that is the right dosage, or you might be getting a pill that has 1,000 times the dose. So, and with the influx of all those pills coming across, it has lowered the cost. Some of these pills these days, they're going for $2 on the street. I mean, you can get a blue fentanyl pill for $2. So if you think about that, some of these users are just trying to get $1-2 and then they're getting their next hit. So it's really brought a bigger population that has access to this unknown drug that could have dire consequences. So it's really stressing out our local resources that we have. And I really do think something needs to change.
Job, one thing that struck me on Glenn's presentation that almost seems like a story in and of itself was that chart that showed the law enforcement officers per 1,000 people in Phoenix, and population growth combined with challenges of recruitment. Is that a challenge that we're seeing in other places across the state? Is that kind of a consistent issue?
I hear it nationwide. I do. I can speak specific to Tucson because I know those numbers. Back in 2000, when I came on, we had over, I think it was 1,100 authorized positions for police officers, about 1,000 cops on the street. Now our authorized number is down to 890, and I think we only have 780 officers. So 20 years, the population of Tucson has grown immensely. They've annexed the area, and we have, a lot less officers on the street. So that number per 1,000 is a really important number to look at when you look at staffing levels of our agencies.
Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom and on the ground experience. Rachel Mitchell, would love your reactions, what you're seeing in our state's largest county, and what maybe can be done here.
Yes, that reflects what we're seeing here. We've heard from retailers across Maricopa County, and they're seeing the impact of people coming in and the increase in retail theft, and not necessarily just organized, but it can be habitual retail theft. We're hearing stories about people going into the bathrooms at restaurants or small businesses and finding somebody passed out or even deceased because they go in the bathroom to use fentanyl. In fact, one retailer told me of 2 employees that because they walked in and got some of the smoke from the fentanyl, that they had to go to the emergency room. So it is profound effect on retailers. And then we're also seeing that the cartels are engaging normally law-abiding citizens in paying them substantial amounts of money to smuggle these pills up from the border. And so people that you would never suspect engaging in criminal activity have gotten involved in criminal activity.
How do they recruit those individuals? Is that through social media, or what are you seeing in terms of the activity there?
That's certainly some of the way that the digital communication that's occurring.
Well, appreciate that. Want to open it up for questions. If anyone has a question for any of our presenters, just please share it in the chat.
And Dan,
As
if I can comment on that,
please.
On that last talking about who's getting involved, Rachel hit the nail on the head. Normally law-abiding citizens, but we also see in Tucson, they're going after our teenagers. They're going after our high school age kids and saying, hey, I'll give you $500 if you make a 45-minute trip down to the border and come back, no risk. So you're getting some kids who now, when they're getting caught, are falling into this life of, having a felony arrest on their record. And it's difficult for, like I said, our youth, that, it's sad to see.
No, it really is heartbreaking to hear that. It doesn't look like we have any questions. We'll give folks another moment here. Oh, we've got one from Jose. What specific federal policy changes would help the situation? I'll let our Rachel Mitchell and Joe weigh in on that first, if you have any thoughts there.
I can speak, as an associate member of the Arizona Police Association. They also represent the Border Patrol agents that are here in Arizona. And really, we have a good system of checking when vehicles are coming through the ports. So there's a lot of technology there that's able to stop some of this. So to me, a federal policy is securing what we can of the border, where we're not making it so easy for even the caravans of migrants to come across. They need to be funneled through the ports, where we have the technology and resources to search, scan, all of that stuff. So I think that is one big policy change that would immensely help out the Border Patrol agents.
And I would agree with that. We know that's where the fentanyl is mostly coming from, and that securing the border is going to be critical.
One question here that I was wondering as well, there has been a lot of news about the rainbow fentanyl targeting of children. What are you seeing in that regard? Is that an issue we're seeing in Arizona? Rachel Mitchell, if you have any thoughts on that from your standpoint.
I was going to defer to Job on that, because that's something that's going to be seen, the impact on that, the overdoses on the street. But yes, it certainly is here in Arizona. We are seeing that, and it's very concerning because it looks like candy instead of a very deadly drug.
Yeah, and I would just go to say again, they're doing anything they can to target a population to get them hooked, to get them addicted to the substance. So a lot of times, your first few pills coming from a certain dealer are free. They just hand them out at parties. They say this is, so they're trying to get you hooked. So that's just one more way that they can try to make it look, appetizing to our children.
And I think it's also important to point out that this is really immediately addicting. This is not something that somebody is going to experiment with necessarily and be able to kick. It's going to capture them very, very quickly. So if somebody thinks that they can just, experiment, they need to understand that that's probably not what's going to happen.
We have a question from Connor at Cronkite News. Is there a particular age group that we're seeing increases in usage among? Anyone, Glenn, I don't know if that's something that your data captured or if anyone else has any observations there.
It is indeed in the data. I don't remember offhand the precise age groups, but it is in the data. If our panelists have kind of offhand notes, otherwise I'll tell you it's going from memory, predominantly sort of prime age males is where we've seen the largest increases over the last couple of years.
When you say prime age, what is that, like in the
25,
40? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Well, we really appreciate everyone participating. Like we said, we're happy to share the recording of this with anyone. Just share your email with us. We really appreciate our participants taking the time to join us and share their experience and what they're seeing in law enforcement and in the prosecutorial realm here as well. Glenn, any final thoughts here to share, key findings, things that you want to leave our guests with?
Yeah, just to reiterate on a couple of points, great points, frankly, that I think Joe made that are part of the nuance of this story that's important to take away is the border security problem is indeed a difference between ports of entry and sort of overland or outside the ports of entry, what CBP calls inland encounters. The ports of entry have relatively high rates of security, right? It's the overland flows that are problematic. And it's there that the gaps have really materialized. I think it's clear in the CBP data, clear in the report that we put together here, that it's there that those gaps have materialized. So there is a blueprint for policy success here. And it's exactly what Job said. It appears to be shift activity away from these overland or inland crossings and back towards the ports of entry, and that will help. The other thing is to kind of give some context on the scale of these costs, which are just the Arizona costs. The $50 billion is about a fifth of the state's total economy all by itself. And so those are a mixture of annual and annualized costs. So it's not directly comparable. It's not like we're losing a fifth of our economy every year, but it is point in time in 2021, roughly 20%. The equivalent of 20% of the state's economy spent or lost to the opioid crisis. So this is massive, and Arizona is really a gateway, is the last point that I'll make here. It's not an Arizona specific cost. It's not even at its worst in Arizona. There are other states that are getting hit harder, but the drugs in those states, the drugs in Colorado, in California, in Oregon, in Minneapolis or Minnesota, the drugs are flowing through border states, particularly Arizona, Texas, and some of these others.
Great point. And I think there's a lot of new information in here on a topic that we've all been reading about and talking about. We appreciate everyone for joining. We hope you cover this, and we hope it drives some fact-based, thoughtful policy solutions from our policymakers. So thanks, everyone, and appreciate the time.
Thank you, Daniel.